All right. So if you're not going to talk, I probably. Oh, okay. We have some hands. Bakhtavar, do you want to go first?
Miss, a general question that how is food the main contributor of the water footprint?
Was it for
And
you? Like when you gave the quiz, was that what, when you gave the calculator, like,
yes,
so for you, food was the highest contributor to water footprint. Is that the case?
yeah,
Okay. So for me as well, food was the major footprint. And within food, I'll say which category was highest for me. Although I didn't give the quiz yesterday, but in general, that's the highest. Who else had food as the highest footprint? Had the highest water footprint? For Shifa as well. Yes, I think the we need a lot of water to grow crops, of course, and this is something that will come back to in the agriculture side, and I think that's all the fun. This is when it all gets very very interesting of how we actually never really look at it like that. Um, so basically, for example, for me, particularly in the category of food, okay, food had the highest contribution in the water footprint, particularly in the category of food. I had meat taking most of the water. And then, it makes you think, why is that the case? That's because in order to feed the dairy industry or the meat industry, or in general, the animals, as we looked at different trophic levels, the water that you would need to grow the crops is something that would account for the water that is needed for food production. And then the water, of course, the animals need themselves. So it's not just the water that they uptake, but the water that they need for the food that is produced for them, for the fodder that is produced for them. So automatically their footprint for water becomes really, really high. And in the last class, we were just looking at the energy footprint, right? Of how the energy input would also, if we were to add artificial inputs, how that would also change, because autotrophs can fix solar or renewable energy, but that is not true for, particularly if we're using a lot of artificial sources, if we're industrializing and using input intensive food, then automatically a lot of fossil fuel energy will go into the industry as well when we mass produce it. Let's go and look at someone's. I think Afaq was the first one who submitted it. So if Afaq is around, let's go to Afaq and see what his water footprint said and what did you learn from the exercise. I think that that would also be more important. But Bakhtawa, does that make sense? Does the answer make sense?
yes, Miss, thank you.
Afaq, are you around?
Yeah.
So go ahead and tell us, what did you see?
Well, I did a survey, and as you can see, my water food category was quite high, and which makes sense because our staple diet is from the wheat roti, and I think that would take a significant amount of water to grow. Aside from that, there was the domestic, and really it shouldn't be that high क्योंकि हमारे घर में जो है कि शावर्स जो होते हैं वो फ्रीक्वेंटली लिए जाते हैं क्योंकि हम लोग एक हॉट एरिया में रहते हैं, लेकिन उसके अलावा वाटर जो है सही तरीके से इस्तेमाल किया जाता है कि ज़्यादा वेस्ट ना हो। लाइक बर्तन धोते हुए बंद किया जाता है, पहले सारे सामान लगाते हैं, फिर एट अ टाइम सारे बर्तन धोते हैं ऐसे ब्रश करते हुए। सो या इट वाज दैट वाज माय एक्सपीरियंस।
Right. And this is interesting. So like we said, a lot of our, and also, if you think beyond just the food production, um, and add a lot of other things that could also contribute equally, or that would also equally consume more water, is that, let's say the food for the animal is produced in some place. So there's one place where the fodder is produced. There's another place where the animals are being raised, or the cattle industry exists. And then you are transporting that. So in the production, in the processing, in the transportation, each step then takes some water. And then, of course, we'll in the next class try and calculate the carbon footprint. It's basically, the same things but different languages. We just are looking at what we're consuming. So you might also, in that case, look at the same things but with the lens of carbon. because carbon is such an important element in our environment. And we'll of course look more at that. Um, but it's good to know that there's this culture, and I always appreciate, I think, the fact that the parents, and this also is like, I also come from a culture where waste in general is discouraged. Um, and I was always like that person who just switched off all the lights, who always made sure that if things weren't in use, they weren't also on. Because then there are a lot of interesting figures there as well in terms of what the use is. So awesome, thank you so much for taking part in it. If we have time, we'll definitely come back to it, but let's go back to the lecture. Where is it? There we go. Right. So as I said, today we will be looking at the hydrosphere, which is the sphere. And we also looked at the fact that hydrosphere is not just water. If that particular ecosystem contains life, then it's also biosphere. And then how life brings a lot of chemicals and nutrients back to the earth, how it contributes to the chemical cycling, that's all then important. And I am teaching it to you in compartments, but the purpose also eventually would be for you to bring them all together in one box and then look at how all of this is interacting. Awesome. So we calculated the water footprint. Let's have a little more discussion on that. So now, would any one of you, from what you calculated, be able to tell us what do you think water footprint is? Like, what is water footprint? Why did I make you calculate it? And feel free to raise your hand or use the chat function to use it. And some people say they do not know what their calculations were, or they weren't too sure about the readings. I think there's another take-home message with this as well. We aren't looking at our practices. And I think one of the reasons why I do want people to, and last time I didn't make people make these exercises compulsory, but I didn't realize, I didn't know who was actually doing it and who wasn't. And I wanted for all of you guys to go through the same process. So I guess the fact that you're not really thinking, how each step, each habit that you have, each work that you do has a water footprint, has an ecological footprint connotation or carbon footprint associated to it, will make you so much more conscious of everything that you do. Yeah, so okay, wonderful, thank you. So you all know that water footprint is basically the volume of water that you're using directly or indirectly for to support your lives. We had a look at the Padlet, so let's just jump to the next thing. So now the question that Bakhtavar asked, right? It is water, but you don't really see it. And the reason why this thinking is important, going back to and calculating a lot of these things is important, because it makes you realize where things are coming from and how you're a part of a bigger system, and you're contributing to a bigger global system and not just a localized city. So you're not just contributing to, let's say, depleting the groundwater if you're over extracting groundwater, but if your food is coming from Balochistan, the meat that you buy is coming from Balochistan, the water that was used to grow the fodder for the livestock is also the water that you use. So you're not only using the groundwater of Lahore, but you're also using the groundwater of Balochistan. And that groundwater that you're using, because you're eating the meat that's coming from Balochistan, is the virtual water. So just like these virtual classes, that's the virtual water that you consume, and it comes under your footprint. Okay, so I'm glad that we have it. This also is a nice exercise because it then impacts your consumption pattern. Generally, we give sweeping statements when it comes to our consumption of resources, right? We say, because we are a poor country, we're from a developing country, our water consumption is really low. But through this exercise, we got to know that yes, our country average is low, but depending on where we are and depending on the resources and the access that we have to what we can do and what we can use, we could be having a water footprint which is maybe higher than someone who's living in the developed world, because they do have choices. They do have a lot of those gadgets and options available to conserve water. And like I said, oftentimes we're not given the choices here to keep our water footprint to minimum, or our footprint in general to minimum. So the averages always are lower, but the truth is that the environmental intersectionality, which I keep talking about, is that, depending on who you are, where you live, how much space you take, and how much you consume, you could be contributing just as much, which is why looking at your individual actions is important. And also, like, water footprint is also something that makes me aware of what I should and shouldn't do, particularly when it comes to my wardrobe and wardrobe choices, as well as, I think, food choices. So the closer it is to home, the lesser environmental impact it would have. Because, for example, if I had vegetable coming from my backyard, and I was using very water efficient irrigation practices. So let's say I had drips for the fruits that I'm eating, and I have all kinds of fruits in my garden, then automatically, my water footprint would reduce. But that would mean that I need to have access to land, and I need to have access to resources to actually be able to do that. Awesome. So yeah, some people posted more information on it. And please, the purpose of doing these exercises and the purpose of bringing you all to that one medium is for you to also see what other people have written and what they've thought and what they think in general, and learn from each other. So make sure that you're not just posting your answers last minute, but are also trying to interact with your class fellows, specifically, maybe not just the water footprint, but the more general questions like the one we had for last class. Make sure you go and read other people's posts as well, because for this, it was probably fairly common. Right, so are we a water-rich planet? So if you think we are a water-rich planet, then give me a thumbs up. If you think we're not a water-rich planet, give me a thumbs down. I don't know, or a sad reaction. I don't know what are the common reactions in Zoom. So a lot of people think we're a water-rich planet, right? If we're a water-rich planet, then why do we say, like, the Third World War, if there is ever any Third World War, it would be around water, right? Because, yeah, why do you think is the war important? And this time you can raise your hand to answer the question. Yes, Daniel, thank you for answering it for me. First of all, I think the one statement that I really love, which I read in one of the reports, is that if you look at some of these countries that really thrive, right? The countries that are really progressive and are really happy as well, there's almost always like a water body at the center of it. For example, if you go to Zurich, if you go to London, all of these cities have a running water, clean, that's the heart of the city. And I read this statement a long time ago, and it just stayed with me, and it always does stay with me. And that is, water is the only divide between progress and between prosperity and poverty. So I think automatically when you have access to water, you can progress well. And of course, this is debatable as well, but most of the times when you have access to water, it is highly possible that you would be or should be able to cross the poverty line, and you could reach levels of prosperity. But there are a lot of, aside from environmental issues, there are a lot of economic, health, and global security issues related to water as well. So that makes it a little more complicated than just looking at the H2O. Okay, so like Daniel said, we do have a lot of water. We read since our childhood that 70% of the earth is covered with water. If someone has a question, maybe you can type it in the chat box, because right now, yes, Live has written it already. 70% of the world is covered with water, but 99% of that water is not usable, right? So if you look at this, for example, you have 96.5% locked in the oceans, which is of course very saline in nature, and then you have saline lakes and also saline groundwater. So together, like, that accounts for almost 98.5, or some roughly around that line. And then now, out of all the water that we have, only 2.5% of that water is fresh water. That is the water that we can use directly. And even that we are impacting with pollution. So we'll also talk about that in a while. And this fresh water now is divided between the locked water, the glaciers, the ice caps that you can't really just go and take, as well as the water that's underground or in the ground. And so a lot of that is also not accessible. And then you're really left with this surface water, which is 1.3% of the 2.5% of the 100% water that we have on ground. And if you thought that this, this 1.3% is at least there, it's, it accounts for the water that's in the atmosphere as well. So all the water or the water vapors that are present in the atmosphere are also, accounted for it. And the water that's contained in biology, so the biological water, that's also accounted for it. So in reality, we have, and even the soil moisture, so in reality, we have very little water, which is available for us from rivers and lakes to consume. And that is why it's become a global issue. It has a lot of economic and societal lenses associated with it. And it's no longer just about what we have. So countries, I think, that have access to clean water, or countries that have access to technology to get clean water for their citizens, are rich countries. So the planet may or may not be water rich. Like, it is water rich, I think, because we still have access to water. But the countries that have water are most certainly rich countries. So in a way, I think Pakistan's a really, really rich country. And we'll try and look at why do I think we still remain below the poverty line, is probably because we aren't consuming it properly. I can take one question. I see a lot of raised hands. So maybe someone who hasn't spoken in the class before, if you could ask a question or comment on anything. Okay, 3, 2, 1, no one speaks, I go on. Okay, so the cryosphere is the sphere where all of that locked ice is, whether that's frozen ground in the form of permafrost, whether that's the icebergs, whether that's the glaciers, whether it's the Arctic, Antarctic, all of those, as well as the sea ice, that is locked, that's not there for us to use. It's generally called the cryosphere, which is also part of the atmosphere, sorry, the hydrosphere. This one, I think I now want to divide it. So first of all, I think I would like to ask you, or maybe there's like a follow-up slide where I can ask you that question, but water is a natural capital, right? It's a resource, it's there. And the good thing is it's a renewable resource. So if you look at the water cycle, yes, a lot of water is saline and it's not usable for us, but naturally there's a system, which is the hydrological cycle or the water cycle, through which naturally this water filters. And I think this is why I would also keep re-emphasizing on looking back at nature for inspiration for science and research, because there's not technology that does not exist in life or on the planet in general. So we have this natural system of filtration of water and of water evaporating and then traveling as clouds and then coming back to a land. So if you look at, like, for example, Pakistan, it's so beautifully designed. It's like gravity just allows for it, and then you have upstream. It's this beautiful watershed, I think, where there can be equitable and just distribution of water because of the way this country topographically is. I think there are a lot of ways for us to even store more, and the kind of weather patterns that we have, if we plan everything slightly better than we do, I think we really are one of the most water-rich countries in the world. So let's first look at the surface water. And I've just put some of the terms, and the definitions should be in your book, but it's just the idea that there's a whole shed. And when it rains, there are pathways for it. And those pathways can then be used to, for example, channel the water elsewhere and use it, or store the water at different points. But then also there's like a social relation to it as well, where people who are upstream, who have access to water, have to make sure that they don't store all the water or divert all the water and keep some water running. And for environment, I think the most important thing is the environmental flows. you cannot extract so much water out of the river that the river eventually dries up. So the river that's eventually going to dump into ocean, that equation is also important. Otherwise, the saline water will come towards the ground because of the natural osmotic processes. So we have to make sure that those environmental flows remain, so that the natural system of water body just maintaining itself, it happens. But I think because, and in the next class, we'll be looking at the Earth's surface, like we'll be looking at the soil, we'll be looking at the lithosphere in more detail. So I thought it would be nice to know the fact that, a lot of us, for example, in Lahore, rely on groundwater that's being brought to our tap. That water basically is the rainwater that is eventually percolated down. And the soil has two zones. One's the Wedo zone, which is unsaturated. So any water that goes in quickly percolates, and then eventually the saturated zone, which has more water. And finally, the aquifer, which is like the big storage grounds of water, which is under the ground, and it's a huge resource as well. I was going to ask you this question, but I think I can say this to you already. Aquifers are while water is renewable, aquifers are non-renewable because this process is really slow. This process has taken a lot of time. And the way that we operate, we extract so much more water than is actually than the recharge, right? Than the recharge of the groundwater. And because of that mismanagement, I think we're ending up losing a lot of our aquifer resources, other than other environmental stresses that we're giving this. Just the over extraction part, and the fact that it is non-renewable. Like naturally, it has taken so many years for this water resource to build under the ground, which is clean, pristine in most places, and we just need to know that. And also, I think from the point of view of Pakistan, it'd be interesting to know that groundwater is not, in some places it's locked, but in some places it moves laterally as well. So for example, from the higher elevations to the lower elevations, it could move laterally too. And so you cannot really, like, except for some of those big aquifers, you cannot really contain it. And also there's a lot of transportation associated with it. And when we talk about pollution, we look at why we think that is problematic. So yeah, we said, just to summarize, we said 99% of the Earth's water is not usable, only 1% is usable, and then 99% of that water is underground. So only roughly 1% of the water is available to us. Yes, and again, a reminder that yes, we are a water-rich planet, but the freshwater resources are always super scarce, and that's why we need to use it rationally and wisely. So I am now going to ask you to use the annotate function to answer some of the questions. You just need to, I think, go to annotate, pick one of the stickers and answer the question. So for example, for me, let's go to, okay. So I think for me, I get my drinking water from ground because it's actually bottled water. So the quality of water, I do not know about the quality of water that I get. I do not treat my water. I just get bottled water, unfortunately, from the corporations that I speak against. And I am in the I do not know zone because my bills are taken off my salary. So I do not know how much money do I pay for my water, the water that I consume. But I do know what I pay for the bottled water, and it is expensive, right? So awesome. So a lot of us know that our drinking water source is definitely coming from groundwater. Most of us do not know what the quality of the water that we drink is. They are mixed, but we do know the reason why we get bottled water or filter and boil the water, I think, is because we know that the water that we are getting is not clean. And that brings me to one of the most important questions, which is the fact that clean drinking water is our basic right. The fact that we're not getting it, I'm getting into the human rights discussions, but I think a lot of the services that we are entitled to as being a normal citizen, you only get to know when you travel to one of the developed worlds. And I think it's just surprising how much peace we have made with being okay with getting, not getting clean water in the tap. The city administration is supposed to make sure that the tap water is drinkable so that we don't have to go and do all the other things that we do. Anyways, interesting. And thank you so much for taking part in the exercise. I will now clear it all and move to the next slide. Oh, except that I forgot to close the edit. Oh, technology. Okay, so there we go. So water cycle, we'll talk about it in the cycle when we talk about the cycling, but I think it was just for a reminder for us to know that there's a natural filtration process, and that is why water is called a renewable resource, even though the water that we can use is very, very scarce in quantity. So many raised hands. I do not know if is there anyone who's dying to ask a question or comment. So any one of you who's like really, really keen on saying something, please do say it. A little bit.
I wanted to ask that the people start the boring and stuff for their domestic water supply. Does that tap into the aquifers then?
Yeah. So the deeper, so for example, remember, so that was the reason why we talked about the saturated zone. So ideally, we are okay to extract water from the saturated zone, right? Wherever it gets clean, because if it's shallow, you'll get more soil with it as well, which is then difficult to filter it or let it settle for a longer time. And then you don't really know whether that's clean. So if you are in the, I think in the saturated zone, you're safe because that is still more renewable. That's still being recharged from the fresher rainwater that we're getting from the planet. But the deeper down we go, and that's why groundwater levels and the downfall in the groundwater levels is so complicated, and that's why there's so much noise around it, because we have like we've gone way beyond that saturated zone, and we've now entered the groundwater aquifers, which are supposed to be the banks of water. And even though their quantities are huge, it's just the fact that then the deeper down you go, a lot of pollutants also lie there, because remember we said that there are a lot of rocks in that sphere of the planet that have a lot of these natural elements. Some of them are not really good for the human health. So oftentimes, like, we need to make sure that that water is, because the deeper down you go, I think the more brackish it will get, and you need to get that water tested. But also, someone told, like, some people said they know what the quality of their water is. Can anyone tell me? Does anyone get their water tested? Do they know that the water that they're drinking is definitely clean? And how do they know it? Is there a way, as a common citizen of Pakistan, for us to know whether the water that we drink is clean or not, if we're not born in Punjab, one of the most clean places?
There was the water salination unit or office where you would send samples of the water and then have it tested for.
Yes. So we are also entitled to information on quality of the water that we get. And some cities, I think, do have a mechanism of reporting the water quality for particularly the filtration plants that are around, because even they can choke and even they can underperform as well. Right. So, we talked about all of this, and this RLC shrinking exercise case study is really, really interesting. And the reason why I think it's interesting is it was, I think, one of the biggest lakes, so inland sea that existed on the planet. So it was, I think, fourth biggest lake, if I'm not wrong. And it was a natural capital, right? People drew a lot of happiness, economy, and all of those terms of prosperity that are associated with water, which I was talking about. This was basically the prime example of that. A lot of economic boom for the people living there. The RL town had a beach, so they would enjoy it. But then when the Soviets started ruling, then they started diverting water for agriculture to bring food security in, which is also important for populations to thrive. But in doing that and in diverting water from the two main rivers that used to feed this, they now had this RLC shrinking and shrinking. And it's really, if you look at it, this is how far it went in 2006. And there was a lot of life associated with not just the life, human life, but also, and prosperity, but also the life that existed there with the wetland ecosystems. And a lot of it was lost. And the reason why I put it here is that, how simple things and simple decisions on increasing our food security or making those small decisions eventually then affect a natural capital. So we have the capacity of degrading a natural capital, and that has long-term impacts. And if you get the time, do go and look at some of the videos and do go and look at some of the interviews. So for a lot of these environmental issues and environmental or natural capital degradation case studies that I'll share and you will see online in general, they go several years after those disasters, several years after the changes had happened, and ask people what it feels like, how did life change for them? And for a lot of interviews, particularly the Aral village, people had left the village. And imagine like they used to see a beach and now all they see is a desert. So a water body converting into a desert in that area. And the water still hasn't reached there. But I think in the northern Aral Sea, they now have built a dam, a World Bank funded dam, and that has made things a little better. But it's still far away from becoming that. I think it has lost 10% of what it had. But look at the effects that it has then on the species, on the life. Its salinity has increased, of course, and life disappears and the industry disappears, and automatically the well-being of people is compromised. So just a way for us to look at things. Now, this is something that I didn't talk about, biomes. I didn't talk about in the previous class, although I should have, but I thought it would get a little more complicated for people who were not too interested in biology and how different ecosystems then become biomes and then they support certain life forms. So for people who are from biology, I'll definitely encourage that when you read the chapter, make sure you read about all of those ecosystems, all of those biomes, and all life forms associated with it. But in aquatic sphere, because I think it's relatively simpler, we'll quickly touch upon it because it would also be unfair to not talk about it. So we have different aquatic biomes, right? There are different salt concentrations. And that means that, so like freshwater, seawater or saline water, and then something which is in transition. So it's like close to freshwater, but also close to marine water. But within the freshwater, we have lakes, rivers, and swamps, and all of these have different characteristics and they have different life forms. We generally do not have life in a lot of life in groundwater, so we do not consider it a biome. So I'll just, as an example, and also just to show how complicated this is as well, show how even a small lake has different zones, and those different zones allow for different life forms to be there and to operate. So you have in the limnatic zone, which is the zone where light can come, all of these freshwater bodies, all of these phytoplankton, zooplankton surviving. So they're plant-like or animal-like small creatures that live in a water body. And then just like we saw in the biomagnification slide, we have the higher life forms. So these planktons are eaten by small fish, then small fishes are food for bigger fishes, and so on. So that's like that zone. But there are also zones where light cannot penetrate. And that means that whatever life that there is, it would definitely not be the life that can produce its own food. So a lot of life that is here in the heterotrophic zone, so this is, let's say, the autotrophic zone. In the heterotrophic zone, a lot of life relies on the detritus that is coming from here down to here. And of course, as you go deep down, these zones would have lesser and lesser light and lesser and lesser ability to create their own food, and totally different conditions. So in the most lower zone, which is the benthic zone, you'll have the decomposers or detritivores, of course. But but and of course their types can change. There can be more turbulent, more static, so more lentic or more lotic lakes or rivers, and that also then changes what life forms would exist there, because in the more turbulent waters, I don't think there's a lot of life compared to the less turbulent water. Or it could be vice versa, depending on the availability of oxygen for life and the availability of light for autotrophs to produce food. But I think something that I would like you to remember here is the fact that there is a littoral zone or littoral zone, which brings a lot of these litter. So whether that's like the nitrates and phosphates that are around us, or whether that's trash that's around us, or whether that's general leaves, etc., the organic detritus, which naturally exists in the environment, all of that can be brought to the lake, and that zone is then called the zone where all the litter exists, and that will compromise on the quality of the water body as well. We can talk about the hardness, hard water and soft water. So like not all water that's available. So even all lakes are not freshwater lakes. So, and that mostly depends on the hardness and of course then on the quality of the water body. Generally, wherever life is, it's more healthier. So do not be overwhelmed with this. It's in your slides, but I just wanted to make a quick statement about how this resource, which is already scarce, is becoming even more scarcer because of us adding a lot of these pollutants. A lot of the pollutants are there naturally as well. Like I said, the sand and silt and or the sediments in a broader category that are in the water also make it a water pollutant because then it's unfit for us to drink. Or some pathogens could exist naturally. Like I said, some heavy metals could exist naturally, but because of our industrial activities, because of the kind of activities that we have, a lot of these pollutants are just there. And I think I would, so like even putting hot water into one of the water bodies that has a stable temperature and certain life form lives there, it would be a pollutant because the life form there is not used to it and it will be destroyed. But I think one thing that I want you to remember is the plant nutrients. So nitrates and phosphates in general are okay, but if we add like wastewater or inorganic fertilizers, which mostly have nitrates and phosphates, and you'll see this a lot around the agricultural lands or where our wastewater goes and accumulates, you'd see a lot of green layer on it. So the algae growth, and that is called eutrophication. Just remember that. And maybe we can focus more on dissolved oxygen in the lectures to come as well. But just for you to have an overview of the kind of pollutants that there are. And how many of you have seen this around? At least when I get to travel, I see a lot of this as well. And thank you for writing more in the chat box. I hope that you're all writing as well. One thing that I wanted to remind you all, and I think thanks to one of the TAs who reminded you, maybe it was Roshan, that it's not, for me, CP is more about all of us listening to each other and all of us learning from each other. It's also about creating an environment where everyone has something to contribute in the class. It's not like I hate toxic competition where no one is talking to each other and there's just this the kind of competition where you're thought to overperform, but you don't really grow as an individual. So for me, this class is a community, and I want for everyone to benefit from this community, as much a non-science student. And so please, I know that this can get overwhelming. This is too much information for someone who hasn't studied science in a long time, even though I've oversimplified it this year. Please do reach out to us. If you're shy and if you do not want to reach out to me, go to one of the TAs. I promise you, I'll give you the office hours where I can teach all of this to you like you would teach it to a 10-year-old. And like we said, this is not a judgmental space. We are here so everyone can understand the issue. And in order to understand the issue, it's important that we know the basics. And I've even oversimplified the basics, as I said. So if you walk away from the class not knowing those, I would be upset with myself. So please do reach out. Please do tell us if you need help with that. And we'd be happy to run over the slides again with you or run over some of the notes from the book with you. But yeah, coming back to eutrophication, I think it happens so much around us that we generally tend to ignore. And there are a lot of other parameters associated to it as well. And we will, like I have this time designed a lecture where we'll look back at some of the nutrient parameters. Yes, Fatma. Okay, I don't know why some people are raising hands and not unmuting. Anyways, so eutrophication is the phenomenon where because of excess nitrates and phosphates, you have this growth. And because of that growth, then remember the different zones of the lake. So actually the picture that I used on purpose was this, which is actually a eutroph. So it wasn't supposed to be there, but I put it there. So imagine if this lake is covered with those algae growing. That would mean that light no longer can penetrate into the lake. And that would then mean that this life is going to die. So if the phytoplankton are not able to create their own food, if they're not able to breathe, and because of the light interaction, oxygen also, because when it moves, like there's a lot of oxygen being diffused back to the water as well. And that's important for life below there. So automatically, when there's no light penetrating, this would then sort of die. And this would become, essentially, this entire lake would become this heterotrophic zone, right? But then for the heterotrophic zone, there would be very little life, or maybe there would be enough life from the detritus that's coming from algae, but the whole structure would change and it would basically become an unhealthy environment where different life forms will thrive, lives that can exist in lesser oxygen, so more anoxic conditions. Interesting how I skipped this. So I think this is another important point, which is the fact that let's say we have, now we understood the lake and we looked at some of the pollutants. Those pollutants can come from point sources or non-point sources. And point sources, like we trace it back. It's my home that is putting its municipal waste into this water body, or it's my industry that is putting at this particular point, discharging it. So I think for point sources, it's easy to trace it back, and it's also easy to put a control, and it's also easy to find. So whatever regulation mechanisms exist, it's easy for point sources to be controlled, I think, and to be monitored. But for non-point sources, where let's say in the entire watershed, there are thousands of homes, and one of the homes is doing something that's adding to polluting this water body. And if that's the case, then, and there are no monitoring mechanisms, we wouldn't know who's polluting it, specifically like if it's combining with all of the streams and coming back. And in that case, I think we need to make sure that there's a proper strict monitoring mechanism. At the outlet of each house, there's a monitoring so that the chemical can be traced back to where it's coming from and then be stopped or treated, etc. And like I said, in the lake, they need oxygen. And that oxygen that they need is called dissolved oxygen. So if they have higher dissolved oxygen, there will be good life form. And if the biological oxygen demand is low, that means it's clean water, because there is enough dissolved oxygen and the demand is not high, right? So let's say the BOD is generally around 1 to 2 for clean water, and the dissolved oxygen is 8 ppm. But as soon as a pollutant would enter, its biological demand, oxygen demand would increase. So for example, in that lake where we had algae grow on top in the eutrophic lake, the oxygen demand would now increase and eventually they'll choke and die. And some of those that can survive will survive in the anaerobic conditions. And eventually, of course, it will, let's say, once the nitrates and phosphates are gone, once the algae dies, eventually I think it will come back. It will take a lot of time for it. But if there's a continuous pollution source, so let's say that this dilution no longer is the solution, then this would be a contaminated lake or a contaminated water body or a contaminated river stream. So just keep these things in mind, because I think they'll help us understand the complexity of the issue and why we need to know about the water quality or environmental quality parameters, which we will discuss in detail in one of the lectures. So this DO, BOD, COD, last time I didn't discuss them in great detail. So this time I have a whole lecture for this as well, just so we know why is it so important to understand not just the fact that there are sources of pollution and pollutants, but also that there are parameters for us to monitor it. And again, this is one of those case studies that everyone has to learn. And it's also just like the RLC, just like that community is devoid of water, this case of water disaster where so many billion gallons of oil were, because it hit an iceberg, it was trying to avoid the glacial ice and it hit the iceberg in Alaska. There was this huge oil spill, and I think they're still paying the price for it. And it, of course, damaged the biosphere so many years down the line. So it happened in 1989. A lot of wildlife still hasn't returned to it. And a lot of this pollution still exists, even though so much has been spent on cleaning it. And again, if you go back and look at some of those videos, and I know I've put too much information because I forget, but like 11 million gallons of crude oil spilled into it. Loss of biodiversity. Just look at how much we lost and how much of oil. So I don't know. I think a lot of people probably just look at it as a case study. For me, Exxon Valdez is and this disaster is important because it's one of those disasters that opened my eyes to the complexity of fossil fuels and to the complexity of fossil fuel transportation, and the prices that we pay in the longer run. So again, like I would encourage you to go back and look at what has happened this many years down the line, and how's the community dealing with it. And also, I think what would be interesting is to look at how these corporations responded to it. In the first 10 days, there was no action. There was literally no, and that shows the priority of these companies, and that is to make money. It's not environment. And then of course, they spent a lot of money eventually to clean it because they had caused the pollution, but so much damage has been done that even after this many years, there's still, like I said, a lot of wildlife hasn't returned to it. So let's go back to the discussion on groundwater. And although I told you a little bit about it, and I gave an indication of how groundwater is, it's difficult because we do not know based on the terrain. There's lateral movement as well. And there's, of course, percolation. So just like surface water can get polluted, groundwater can get polluted as well. So in all of our pumping wells can also serve as an injection well for hazardous substances to go in. Now, while removing it, of course, it's costly to remove pollutants from surface water, but it's even more complicated to remove it from groundwater, excuse me. So basically what happens is that in groundwater, first of all, we do not know, if the groundwater just goes in, and we'll also look at it from the solid waste management point of view when we look at some of the future slides. But let's say these chemicals go down, and then that chemical is now traveling. So you have to understand all of that too. You have to put several points, and sometimes, because like we said, on surface water, there's oxygen, there's sunlight, there are all of those resources. There's a lot of life form that can help us degrade it. Generally in groundwater, there's not all of those ideal conditions for things to be degraded. So whatever goes there can remain there for thousands of years. And so I think it's important to also make sure that we do not pollute our groundwater resources. So of course, the volume is one, but then polluting it is another. And if you have come across the news, you'll see that we're actually polluting a lot of our groundwater. Most of it is really polluted, sometimes naturally with things like arsenic, or sometimes also because of our industrial activities and anthropogenic activities. Anyways, so to quickly go back to being a water-rich planet, but also being a water-scarce planet, there is this term. So I think although we fall in the water scarce category, I personally think we are water stressed country. Yes, we do not have that much water available per person, but countries like some of the countries in Africa that have very less water available per person, and of course that availability would decrease, are absolutely scarce. So and I think we fall in the lines of, for example, here, physical scarcity, and then approaching physical scarcity. So yeah, just understanding of these terms, really, it's okay for you to not remember a lot of facts and figures, but definitely the scarcity figure. And of course that threatens us more. If we are someone who's residing in the north, climate change threatens us more. If you are someone who is in Balochistan, extended droughts would threaten us more, and actually all over the country as well. More rains are a problem, but equally less rain or no rain is a problem. And the sphere is changing, temperatures are changing, the sphere is changing, life is changing. The fact that we're adding so many pollutants to it is changing. I think a lot of it also is related to population increase, which is in your books, and also like your book discusses it in great detail, but also urbanization. This time, whoever's raised their hand is allowed to speak, but you have 2 seconds to unmute and speak.
अच्छा मैम मैंने कर दिया मैम आई वांटेड टू आस्क कि अभी आप पिछले वो डायग्राम पे जा सकते हैं वापस if possible.
जी जरूर. Which one do you want to go?
ये मैप पे तो so something I've like always heard is कि जो आपके northern areas होते हैं उधर like clean water की ज़्यादा problem होती है and that's kind of why like इतनी ज़्यादा वो waterborne diseases भी होती हैं and everything like that. So this diagram's kind of like showing कि इतना ज़्यादा वो northern areas में मसला नहीं है. This is like something which is way more prevalent in the south. So could you like provide some clarification on that?
So I think this particular risk is associated with climate change and changes in the weather pattern. And then, of course, because of that, the water availability. So I think this graph doesn't focus that much on the quality of water. It talks more about the quantity of water. And I think in terms of quantity of water, we are actually much richer than rest of the regions. And because we have that bank, that water bank upstream, we always imagine, that we would be rich. But that, now that I'm talking about it, it's also a little complicated because in winters we actually have less water, and in winters the weather doesn't allow for us to have agricultural crops. But I think in general, yes, the sediment load is high, and the water quality is degrading because of the way we manage our water. I think it has something to do with where it's coming from and some of those natural sources of pollutants. But a lot of villages do have clean sources of water. And yes, the sediment load is high, but some form of filtration would actually help the communities deal with it. Like it's not a very industrial waste-laden or municipal waste-laden water. But that said, it's now changing because I have heard stories of people putting their expired, pharmacists putting their expired medicines into it. And just imagine like what those drugs would do to life downstream. But yeah, good question. And like I said, things are evolving. So the traditional ideas that we had about things are no longer applicable. And this one, I would personally feel that yes, we have lesser risk in terms of water availability, but we have the risk of a disaster is so much higher than anywhere else in Pakistan. Specifically, if you are there when it's raining, and in the summer season when the glacial melt is high, and when it's also raining and there are landslides, the risk just amplifies, right? Because then there's risk to our livelihood and there's risk to our social security as well. So does that kind of answer what you are asking, Asad, or would you still want to ask something?
Yes, ma'am, it does. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so I think there are several lenses of looking at it, and imagine we're not even like talking about quality at the moment, and I think we need to always go back and see how this particular graph is defining risks. Would highly encourage you guys, and because Punjab relies a lot on, we've polluted, I think, most of our surface water, but I think something that I would want to mention here is the fact there's uncontrolled tube wells, and everyone has access. There's no mechanism to monitor it. So we said that our groundwater resources, our aquifers are non-renewable. Our groundwater is renewable, but our aquifers are non-renewable because they take a lot of time. but the rate at which we're just putting tube wells there without any monitoring, and the rate at which it's being subsidized, I think that's dangerous. So these are some of the news excerpts that I just put, because it's also nice to see what's being done and what's being said. And this term should have increased, like this number should have increased a lot already, because a lot of it is not even monitored, right? Anyone can go and do it. Okay, but then the question comes that how do we make more water available for people? So the first is just like the RLC, build a dam, try and store some water. And again, this is from an environmental scientist point of view, dams are really, really controversial because there's a lot of compromise that we make in terms of land loss and in terms of biodiversity, and also in terms of, for example, the environmental laws and riparian rights of people who live above a dam or below a dam, and then people who get to move. So all of those consequences, of course, are written here. But I think if we want to be a little more water secure, then one of the ways to make more water available is to building dams. As environmentalists, I think we like the idea of small dams or the check dams, which these small storage actually allow for water availability, for security, I think, or for low risk, both in times of flood and in times of drought. So if you have it stored when you don't have water, you can use it, but when there's excess water, you'll have some backup to store it as well. So yeah, all the runoff, collecting it, building these dams, building these huge reservoirs that then have a lot of implications, both social and environmental. I think a lot of you know it, so I will not go into great detail here. The other way to make water available is to treat that saline water, to extract water and leave the salt behind in the saline water that's available to us. And that process is called desalination, and some people call it desalinization. And we can do it through several ways, right? We can distillate it. For example, we boil it, it evaporates, condenses, and then we know it's relatively clean, or we filter it. And in the case of reverse osmosis, it's very high filtration above the nanoscale. So you're expecting only water molecules to pass through and all of the soils to remain behind. But there are also issues with the reverse osmosis plants. They're very energy intensive. You have to apply a lot of pressure to get filtered water on the other side of the filter. It's very, very energy intensive. And of course, you need to clean the membrane and it can clog. And all of that excess salt that stays also has to be then taken back to the ocean. So the oceans, or that part of ocean where salt is being dumped, become more saline. And that has been the biggest issue, actually. This brine has been the biggest issue in the desalination process. So, and this is one of my favorite examples, the fact that there is a city in the world that is drinking treated wastewater, and they call it new water. So Singapore has always inspired me. They're using membrane bioreactor techniques and other membrane filtration techniques too, because transporting fresh water was very, very costly for them. And remember these terms, okay? That they do in the first step, they do ultrafiltration or microfiltration. In the second step, they do reverse osmosis, which you already talked about. And then they UV disinfect to get rid of any pollutants, biological pollutants that are there, right? But then again, we say that it's a little more cost efficient to desalination, at least for Singapore. So that's why they opted for wastewater treatment rather than desalination, or instead of transporting freshwater resources. So microfiltration and ultrafiltration are here. So this is their step one. They filter it down to this level where most of the divalent ions and monovalent ions are removed, most, not all. And then the second step is reverse osmosis, where ideally only water molecules should pass through. And the third step is UV disinfection, where you disinfect all of the pollutants if there is any. Oh, I want to ask you this question, and let's see how much time we have, because I also want some time for discussion. Okay, so how many of you drink bottled water? And I do, I know. And what do you know that there are biological consequences to it? And what are those consequences? Let me quickly head to the chat. Yeah, awesome that you guys are reading and you guys already know the things that I'm saying. Okay. Okay, so basically these plastic have, first of all, they're not recycled. So there's the biggest threat. The second threat is that there are a lot of additives that we add to plastic to make it more user or friendly, or to change its plasticity, etc. And those are carcinogenic in nature. And you must have read a lot of news or come across news that says the more you expose it to sunlight, the more the carcinogenic compounds leach into water. So be careful with using plastic, because a lot of these additives are not good for our health. And I'm slowly coming towards the discussion on plastic that we'll eventually have. So, just that. And also, I think when it comes to bottled water, I do then like to remind people that we pay so much cost for the bottled water. So for that 19 liter, I think I pay over 260 to 80 rupees. And the cost that a farmer pays for 1 acre of land for the whole year, for the water that he gets for the entire year, is also roughly that amount. So look at how much money people who are extracting our water are making out of these bottled water, and look at how for granted this commodity is when we provide it in million acre feet to the people. And that brings me to another point before we move forward, that a lot of our water goes into agriculture, and a lot of our agricultural practices are inefficient. And the fact that we haven't prices, and Sarah's here, I know Sarah talked a lot about pricing and giving incentives to make sure that we reduce these behaviors, these patterns of degrading our natural capital. But I don't think we've been extremely successful. Okay, so I think I can take some questions because I feel like I've talked a lot at you today. There was one interesting question. I hope I haven't missed it. What was it? Is this water safe? Is the water, so you're asking the water that is taken from wastewater? Yes. Did you know? So I'm like a wastewater treatment person. So now you bring me to the field that I absolutely love. So fact check. Pakistan only treats 2% of its wastewater, which is ridiculous, because that means that most of the wastewater, untreated wastewater, goes into your freshwater bodies. And that means that most of the fresh water that you're consuming or is coming to your house and that you're using for multiple purposes is contaminated, right? So the best way, and that process is called reclamation of wastewater or treatment of wastewater, where you are reclaiming that 99% water that is in the wastewater. It's really water, guys. It's just H2O. It doesn't change its religion when it is treated. So basically, as long as it's just water. But I do think that for people like us who've been brought up with a certain perception, it would take us a while to get used to it. Even in a lot of these countries, people say, don't tell us it's treated wastewater, just give us water. And I was looking at one of a paper for Australia even. So in many countries, like this wastewater that's being treated, they generally take it to us. For example, when I was in Jordan and working with this on the wastewater treatment of refugee camp, they used 2 different treatment techniques. One was membrane filtration, or membrane bioreactors. So it was giving high quality water. The other was trickling filter, where it slowly filters. And then this was not as good at treatment. And those 2, when they combined, became met the standards of the city and were kept in a big storage pond that they had created. And what was I talking about? Yeah, so basically when you put it in that storage tank, you're allowing for that water to percolate down to the ground. And sometimes people, if it's meeting the standards, if it's below the government's drinking water standards, then you can also directly put it in a water body. So you can put it into a lake or a river. But a lot of people say that do not tell us that you've put treated wastewater here. Just give us that water and tell us that it's safe to drink. And yes, it is safe to drink. Like I said, it is H2O. and they make sure that there's no contaminant in it, and their water might actually be cleaner than the water you and I get in our tap. But there's also another interesting question which Behram has asked. Behram, my PhD was 2 techniques, and one of those techniques was vaporization that you call, but membrane distillation. So you heat up the water, you convert it into water vapors, and you use a membrane that only allows water vapors to pass through, so for only gas to pass through and not water to pass through. And you colden the other side, and the process of condensation allows for only clean water to go to the other side. So yeah, this is a fascinating field. But please let me know if I've missed any important question, because I would really love to answer it. And while you are there, let me quickly just talk about the climate change side of it, and the runoff. And I think I didn't talk enough about it last time. So we did talk about the storage capacity of a soil. We talked about water raining in a certain catchment upstream and for it to come downstream through a watershed. We talked about increasing storage capacities. I think this is now related to floods. And when there's excess water, no matter how well do we plan, with extreme weather events, eventually, if all of this system is saturated, you will have floods. So we just need to get to the point that we need to do a very good planning at making sure that our communities are safe, but eventually we will have some of those. And yeah, there are various approaches to flood proofing a city. And those were in your book, so I wouldn't talk in a great detail about it. I have never come down to the thank you slide, which this is one of the reasons why I picked this slide template, and I never really got it. So I wanted to make sure that today we end here. But the floor is now open for question, and I'm sorry for ignoring so many raised hands because you never really unmuted quickly and answered. So please raise your hand now and ask me any question that you have, and I'll try and go through the. Awesome. Where do we start? Suba, please remind me and correct me if I'm saying your names wrong.
It's Subha.
Subha. Okay.
Yeah.
So you are actually you could be the class title, or our class. Go ahead, Subha.
Right. So I wanted to ask, you mentioned how water that is bottled in a plastic bottle is not safe. So for example, if we use an alternative, which is through the filtration plants which are located nearby our homes, and if we boil that water, does it not make it safer? Like, because this is something that I've been hearing ever since I was a kid, that if we boil water that comes from filtration plants, then it becomes very safe to drink because it kills all the germs. Is it true or not?
Well, that's an interesting question, and thank you for asking it. So here's the deal. The filtration plants, for example, if you looked at, I showed you what the level of filtrations and what it removes. So if your filtration unit tells you that your filtration membrane is up to microfiltration, then definitely bacteria are removed, but viruses are not, right? For viruses, you need to go as down as to nanofiltration, I think. So thinking, and I know that none of our water treatment plants have RO, at least none that I'm aware of. I think most of it is micro and ultrafiltration, in which case some pollutants are still there, but most of the pollutants have gone. And so, which is why you should definitely boil it, because boiling kills most of those pollutants. When I was working with membrane bioreactor in my master's, I realized that yes, the filtration allows for the bacteria to remain on this side, but once the water has come on the other side, it is exposed to newer water. So when newer sources of pollutants. So the pipe that it's going through, if that has a contamination, then that water can be contaminated. So when I plated that bacteria, I could see a lot of bacteria as well. So absolutely, you're doing it absolutely right, where you're getting rid of most of the chemical and biological pollutants and whatever there is, you're boiling it. And because there's no plastic in use, you should be okay. And if it's short-term use, maybe you should also be okay. But like always relying on these water bottles, I think is not and some companies are changing the composition of their water bottle to make sure it's safe, but it has a lot of additives, which is not good. They keep leaching into the water that we have. Pardon. Okay. Next question. Which hand is raised? Hanya.
Yeah, ma'am. Earlier you mentioned aquifers, and the book also mentioned it. I don't really get what they are. Like, are they man-made or are they naturally occurring? Could you like explain that?
Absolutely. So yeah, thank you, and please do keep me back to these things, because I just presume that people would know, and I do not like sharing definitions in the class because I think they take a lot of time, and I rely more on common sense and oversimplifying things. But please do bring me back to any concept that you think I didn't explain properly. So, like I said, just imagine the ground that you're sitting on. And now look at one of the pumps that you have around your home, which is extracting groundwater. And also, if you were able to see the process of pumping that water, of putting that pump underground, you would see that a lot of soil was taken. And as soil was taken out, there was initially drier soil, then more muddy soil, and then they started extracting muddy water, and eventually you started getting clean water. Right? So let's just stay until there and divide it into the saturated zone and the unsaturated zone. So the saturated zone below, which has more water, and the unsaturated zone above, which has less water because most of it percolates down to the ground, is the several zones in the water that we eventually get to. And so drier soil, muddy soil, more water rich, like, or more soil moisture soil, and then eventually cleaner water soil. So there are now these reservoirs. So let's call them underground or ground rivers. Just like we have a surface water body, we have a groundwater body. And that groundwater body is aquifers. And just like we have like big storage, so consider aquifers the dams of underground water. Right, these big reservoirs. So while we do have these smaller reservoirs, very deep down, there is this huge bank of water that's lying there, and that is aquifer, and all of it, almost all of it is natural. But like I said, it is very time-taking and it's very slow. And that saturated zone, we extract groundwater from. But so for example, I was in Balochistan in July, and they were telling me, ideally, the groundwater starts, so the saturated zone starts from somewhat 25, 30, 40 feet, depending on what the water level is. We have gone down, for example, in Punjab to 100, 150, 200, 300. In Balochistan, they were talking about 700 feet, 800 feet. And the deeper down they continue to go, the more they will exploit, and then changes will happen because and there are also interesting ideas. When you over extract the groundwater, do you think that structure will remain the same? So there are a lot of changes that also then happen to the physical qualities of that particular space. But I think because we're now talking about the hydrosphere, let's just focus on it. And yeah, it's all natural. It's all there. We're just exploring them, and we're just taking advantage of them. And it's just a source of water for us. But yeah, it's like from top to bottom, it's less and less healthy to go there for the planet, at least. Next question, please. What is biogas? That's a good question, and maybe I can address it here. So biogas is essentially methane and a combination of other gases, and I don't know if anyone from the group wants to answer it. Please feel free to raise your hand and answer it. So it's basically when you have all of this solid waste, or in general all the organic waste coming together, it degrades, and in the process carbon dioxide is released, methane is released, and carbon monoxide is released, and a combination of all three, but majorly dominated by methane, is biogas. And it's actually like natural gas. So you can, if you look up on the internet, some of the landfills that are engineered and have now been closed, like totally closed, shut down, there would be this pipe on top of it, and it will always have a flame. That flame is from burning that methane, and it's basically, yeah, it's natural. Biogas is the natural gas, and it's healthier than the gas, the LNG or that we get from fossil fuels. So the same methane that we get from fossil fuels. I hope that answers. Methane's lightest, yes. Who else do we have? And people who want to leave, of course, you're more than welcome to leave as well. And this includes the TS, because you're okay to leave. So Behnam, I can go to you next, and then Zain.
Okay, thank you so much. So I want to ask about a biological technique which is called rectal rehydration. So in case of काफी ज़्यादा water available now, so we can go for that technique like rectal rehydration, जो कि अक्सर औकात discovery में भी दिखाते रहते हैं.
And do you want to explain it to the class?
Like you have to insert a tube in your rectum, and then the contaminated water gets into your body, and it gets filtrated through a large intestine, and basically absorbed from the membrane of large intestine.
Yeah, but I'll have mixed comments about it, and I think it depends on how people feel about it. So, for example, a lot of times you would see kids being shown that have a more injection like or bottles that's where you really just filter it on the spot. So people who have really murky and dirty water, they kind of just use some of those easy, handy things. I think with taking it to the rectum, I think there's a limit to how much toxicity we can tolerate, and a lot of them are carcinogenic in nature. A lot of them impact our long-term health. So as long as it's only in times of disasters, I think that's okay. But I would be, and there are a lot of natural ways. So when we talk more about wastewater treatment, just allowing for the sunlight to be there, allowing for all the bacteria to eat all the food, and then turn it eventually on to leave only that 99% water behind is also possible. If there are not many other chemicals. So for me, as long as the solution is simple and more nature inspired, I think the more achievable it is compared to like complicating it too much and making it difficult for people. But yeah, I think every innovation counts, and I hope we get to talk about some of the innovations as well. Every emergency relief counts, every on-time solution counts, and we can look at it in more detail. But thank you for adding that information to the class. Then you had something to ask as well. Okay, Zen's not around. Asad, you can go next.
अच्छा मैम, सो मैं पूछना था कि वो जो आपने 86% वाला नंबर शेयर किया था about how 86% of bottles aren't recycled, that was like something which was really alarming for me, because मुझे लगा था कि इससे काफी कम नंबर होगा, because I like to think कि काफी ज्यादा लोगों को अब आहिस्ता आहिस्ता अवेयरनेस आ रही है इस चीज की. So one thing which happened like a few weeks or a month or two back was कि KFC kind of introduced these recycling machines where they were like, if you like put in some bottles, plastic key, and just recycle those, so will give you discounts. So for Usvik, there was like a lot of hype about like recycling, and everyone was like, bottle jama karo aur udhar leke jao. And that just like kind of made me wonder, is there like the lack of recycling, is this something which is because of a lack of incentive by the government? Like, is this something which the government could incentivize? Like, agar hum recycling machines वगैरह set up kar lein in different parts of the city, like, do you think that could be something which definitely increases it? Because I feel like logon ke paas shayad incentive na ho, and even though they have the awareness, they might just end up being lazy at times.
Yeah, I think recycling also at times super greenwashed. So people think that recycling is the solution, but recycling is not the ultimate solution, right? So first of all, when we create plastic, and we'll talk more about it when we come to the lecture on plastic. So when we talk about plastic, already it's coming from fossil fuels as its raw material. Already it's super water intensive. But I think the problem with non-recycling of plastic is it says it's recyclable. When you read the plastic bottle, it says it's recyclable, but that doesn't guarantee the fact that it is being recycled. And there are a lot of leaks in the system. Actually, in countries like ours, it is so much better. The scavenging is so much better because people get like the informal sector does get money out of it. But I think there's still a lot of leaks in the system, and if you go to the dump sites, um, and even the developed world has gotten away with some of it. You know what they do? Most of the times they send their waste to countries like Malaysia, plastic waste to countries like Malaysia, and even if that plastic bottle is recycled, there's a certain number up to which you can recycle a bottle, and you'll eventually have to send it to the landfill. So first of all, we do not have enough recycling systems, and that's why there could be leaks. And then most of them go to the environment. So all of that PET bottle you end up seeing in the oceans in most of the documentaries. So I don't know if you've seen things like some of these new documentaries that have come out on Netflix that show you the amount of PET bottles that are there. So even though PET bottles and the others are the ones that are most recycled and most scavenged, there's still a lot of leak in the system, and that figure can vary, I think, from country to country. But I would think that most of it is not recycled. And if it's recycled, after 5 times, it goes to the environment as a waste anyway. Yes, Neeson.
So, ma'am, I wanted to ask, why don't the companies use biodegradable, disposable water bottles instead of plastic bottles?
Yeah.
Like, अगर हम
Yeah, go ahead. Keep talking.
yes, so like अगर हम देखें तो प्लास्टिक बहुत ज़्यादा वेस्ट भी होता है और उसको रिसाइकल भी, जैसे आपने बताया कि बहुत कम किया जाता है। तो अगर हम बायोडिग्रेडेबल बोतल्स लें जो कि पेपर मेड बोतल होती हैं, जैसे कि जूस के कैंस होते हैं, तो उसमें हमें वेस्टेज से ज़्यादा बच जाएंगे और जो वाटर है वो भी वेस्टेज से बच जाए।
जी जी बिल्कुल ऐसे ही है, लेकिन थोड़ा वो भी थोड़ा एरिया कॉम्प्लिकेटेड है, एंड मे बी आई कैन शेयर माय रिसर्च दैट आई एम डूइंग. Biodegradable and compostable plastic is also a very greenwashed term. Again, हर वो चीज़ जिसको हम कहते हैं कि biodegradable है is not biodegraded. उसको biodegrade होने के लिए environment में certain conditions चाहिए. अगर वो conditions उसको नहीं मिलते तो वो भी एक ordinary plastic की तरह thousands of years आपके environment में रहेगा. So I think fact one. Basically, bioplastic or biodegradable plastic probably is plastic that's coming from the environment, or उनके bonds वगैरह आप weaken कर देते हैं. But I think one of the drawbacks that I've seen a lot in terms of the discussion on microplastic is that जब ये सारा biodegrade for them means it's converting into smaller pieces, but then those smaller pieces acting like normal microplastic pieces which are non-biodegradable. तो ये terms भी थोड़े dodgy हैं और ये terms बहुत नए हैं और ये terms इतने scientifically explored नहीं है. Even वो जो compostable हैं उनको भी जब तक वो सही composting conditions नहीं मिलती वो degrade नहीं होते actually. और उन पे मुझे नहीं लगता कि इतनी scientific backing है. और ये चीज़ें भी सोचना आई थिंक ज़रूरी है, क्योंकि हम लोगों को ज़ाहिर बताया ये जाता है कि oh wow, biodegradable is the solution, and then you start using it only to find 10 years later that it was just another scam to make you to keep consuming. So I think a lot of times we have to question a lot of these behaviors और थोड़ा scientifically evidence based backing के साथ उनको देखने की ज़रूरत है. But yeah, I think it's still better than fracking and taking fossil fuel out and creating plastic from there, because uski source at least clean hoti hai compared to, you know, degradation baad ki kahani hai, but at least uska source relatively clean hota hai. Are we good, or is there any other question or comment? Yes, I said.
Sorry for asking so many questions. लेकिन मैम एक और चीज मैं सहमत थी. This is just something like ये these are like all problems which I feel like they were always in society, but like people never actively thought of it. So अब बस वही thought process चल रही है. So मैम like कुछ अर्से पहले I saw this documentary on Netflix called The Game Changer, and that was kind of basing like उनकी बेसिकली आर्ग्यूमेंट का जो प्रेमिस था वो यही था कि आपकी जो एनिमल बेस्ड प्रोटीन है या फिर आपकी जो एनिमल बेस्ड डाइट है, that is not something which is good for you. Like they were making a very strong case for like a vegetarian diet, for example. So like I was already having doubts about like animal based diets after seeing that documentary. और फिर जब मैंने कल रात को क्विज ली थी तो फिर उसके बाद तो like मुझे और ज्यादा शुरू हो गया, because like eggs और animal और dairy products इन सब के like water consumption इतनी high थी, और vegetables की even though like I do eat a lot of vegetables उसकी फिर भी बहुत कम थी. So I was just wondering, like, if someone was to switch from like a more animal-based diet to a more plant-based diet, is that something which would make a meaningful change, or do you think, objectively, since it's just one person or it's like a very minor micro thing, so it might not lead to like that meaningful change?
So there are both both can be true. For example, if every individual would start thinking like you, and if every individual would make that small change, it's no longer one person, but 7 billion people on the planet. And that goes for pollution as well, right? For example, in the case of water bottle, there's this very famous line that made a lot of rounds, that it's only one plastic bottle said 7 billion people, and it was now 7 billion plastic bottles. So I think individual actions do have a part to play, particularly if you eventually then bring your communities to act with you. You pressurize your state to give you those incentives to make the change. But yeah, I've struggled with this because I eat very little, and that meat-based protein is something that I think I need. Otherwise, when I've tried to go vegetarian, and I have tried it at several points in my life, I think I become a little more weak physically because I already am very skinny. So and my body, like, it's going to take time for my body to adapt. And in the little 3-4 months experiments I've done, I've struggled, but I don't think it's impossible, because a lot of my friends had vegetable-based diets and they were doing fine. And there are ways to mitigate. But I personally also think that if we use this sustainably, right? So for example, if our meat source were to come, for example, from Balochistan, where most of the grazing is rangeland and it's not industrialized, it could make a difference. And if the practices are irrigation efficient, etc., it could make a difference. But I wouldn't say go radical, but I think make those choices. Like if your protein source can be met with most of the dals that we eat, just go with those. Rather than the pulses, rather than meat. But also it's not an easy decision, because I have, and welcome to our lives, the lives of people who are more conscious, because then you kind of feel guilty at the system. So every time I've wanted to go vegetarian, I've always come back. And I do know a lot of people who'd gone completely vegetarian, but doctors advise them to come back to eating little meat. So maybe, like, I don't know, meat on a couple of days and then mostly vegetable-based diet. That is meeting all of your micro and macronutrients could make a difference. But it's a journey, I think. And I would like to know what you decide and what you eventually do. So please do let me know about the progress. At least this is what has happened with me, and I feel guilty about it because I'm always teaching the students how bad it is. And then I have struggled with going vegetarian. Like after 3 months, I come back to meat because I feel I overwork, and I sometimes feel that I need that.
Ma'am, but do you think like you resorting back to an animal-based diet, that's something because it's something you can control, or do you think it might be because आपका जो environment है, that's making it really hard for you to like do that. Because this time I think being a vegan in the US is something which is much easier than being a vegan in Pakistan. क्योंकि जैसा मैं बड़ा excited था जब मैं लम्स आया ना, I was like कि अच्छा अब इतने PDC के भी options होते हैं, ये भी होते हैं इधर उधर, I'll like shop and I'll like make sure कि थोड़ा vegan diet हो जाऊँ. फिर उसके बाद मैं इम्तियाज स्टोर गया और वहाँ मैंने almond milk देखा and I was like, you know, कितना महंगा होगा. और फिर मैंने उनसे उनकी प्राइस पूछी and they were like 1,000 रुपए का 1 लीटर and I was like, let's just go back to milk pack. So
Yeah, so that is, it's actually costly everywhere. Like you have no idea how costly life. But there, like I had friends who used to make their own soy milk at home. It requires a lot of efforts, as well, but it is not impossible. I have seen those people, and that's why I admire those people, and that's why I know it is possible. But it requires a lot of sacrifice and giving up. And yeah, my body is adapted to it, which is why my body doesn't cooperate with me when I go meat less for a longer time. But I do think it's possible. And maybe if I had more time, because right now I'm living alone and I have to take care of myself, maybe like if I had more people taking care of me and feeding me the right quantities of protein and everything, I would go vegetarian. But for now, I just eventually, and then our options are limited, right? So mostly my lunches are PDC based and they're mostly meat based as well. But at home, I try not to cook too much meat. Awesome. So are we done, or do you have another thought?
I think that's enough for this week.
Okay,
Maybe
awesome.
next week.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating, for staying back. Let's just close this.